Neil, one of the drivers of these rate increases is higher fuel costs. Jet fuel was already more than 30% of total operating costs before any of this. It's nearly doubled in price since the war began and is still around 70% above its pre-conflict level, according to Rotate, even after easing slightly on ceasefire news. And we are starting to see a supply crunch in Asia. China and Thailand have suspended jet fuel exports. Vietnam is cutting domestic flights. The Philippines has declared a national energy emergency. For freighter operators on the lanes most exposed to this, particularly less fuel efficient aircraft, how concerning is all this for operators, for charterers, for their customers?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the question. I mean, I'm going to take a minute here to respond because there's sort of multiple components to consider, when it comes to this question of jet fuel, and also just the impact that it's going to have, not only sort of in the next couple weeks, but over the course of the next several months, right? Because this isn't a situation that resolves itself overnight. Even if the conflict ends tomorrow and the strait opens up, these supply chains for crude have been disrupted for so long now that the implications are going to take weeks, if not months, to resolve, further downstream. But if you look at what you had mentioned, earlier, right, there are many countries in the world that don't have their own sovereign production of refined products, right? And you mentioned several of them, Vietnam, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia weren't at the top of your list, but these are countries that do not refine a lot of their own products that they consume. And so it doesn't matter what the price, if nobody is willing to export these refined products to them, they are going to run out of supply. And I think in many of these countries, they are getting dangerously close, to the line where there will be sort of severe impact. And in fact, when this crisis started, what was the first airline to structurally cut capacity that was not directly in the conflict zone? Air New Zealand. They cut 7% of their capacity. They were the first carrier to announce that. Now, several others have announced since then, but you think, oh, why these guys? Well, they knew they were going to have a problem coming up. And so, this crisis, it's a reality today. And, on a supply side, it's very, very real. Now, let's think a little bit longer term about what happens here, right? And how capacity is going to be impacted, both on the freighter and belly side, right? Because as this thing drags on, there are going to be two different impacts, right? So on the freighter side, yield increases on a global basis aren't enough to cover the increase in fuel. Fuel is up 100% plus, right, in many markets. And so yield growth has been relatively uneven. Carriers have put in fuel surcharges and all, but yields still haven't kept up to the extent they need to make some borderline flying or remain sort of even break even. It's become quite unprofitable, which is why you've seen capacity declines even in markets like US to Latin America. How is this impacted by the war? People will think, well, it's because, the input costs have gone up and all of a sudden, they can't operate 5 days a week to Montevideo from Miami. It can only be 3 because that's the only way they can make their flying profitable. So you're inevitably going to continue to see more route trimming from the freighter operators as they get rid of unprofitable flying. On the passenger side, it's a slightly different story. And so if you think about the passenger carriers, they're not all built equally. They all pay the same for jet fuel maybe, but they're not all built equally. There are premium carriers which are much more insulated from this crisis because their passengers are less impacted by the price of gas or the price of food or other input costs. And because they rely much more heavily on premium traffic, their demand has held up very well. If you look at the stock prices of Delta and United, the two most premium U.S. carriers, they've barely been impacted by this crisis. And it's because their balance sheets and their P&Ls have remained intact. Delta even owns their own refinery, so they're slightly hedged from jet fuel. That's going to contribute $1 billion in profit to them this year alone, at least, because they're managing the crack spread between crude and jet. There are other carriers whose demand curves are much more elastic. They rely on leisure travel. These carriers are going to start to get really impacted as we get into the early summer and through the summer because their demand's going to evaporate. And so you're going to see a lot of route cuts as a result of that. And these are global. You can think Spirit and Frontier in the US, AirAsia or Scoot in Asia. You can think Ryanair and other carriers in Europe. They're the ones that are going to be more heavily impacted, over time. And I suspect we're going to lose a material amount of belly capacity as a result. So complex story, complex implications.
There's various stories that have come out say, oh, well, those that have hedged their future fuel costs are going to have a competitive advantage. They might need to cancel services. We discussed this off air a little. Can you explain why that won't really be a massive factor for most operators?
Yeah, and hedges sort of fell out of favor, over the past few years as fuel stabilized, right? So many carriers don't even have hedges in place today. None of the U.S. carriers, for example, have any material hedge position. I did mention Delta owning a refinery, which they've owned now for 12 years. That is a natural hedge against the crack spread, right, which is now yielding significant benefit to Delta on the tune of about 25 to 30 cents a gallon. But there are carriers around the world who are hedged 15, 20, 30%, and they will now benefit from that hedge. But I think there's not a single carrier that's immune to what's going on. It's not like they've got 100% hedge in place and all of a sudden they're still paying $2 a gallon for jet fuel.